Airport cop disrespects black woman at check-in, unaware she's a high-ranking FBI agent. In the bustling heart of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a seemingly ordinary travel day sets the stage for an unforgettable showdown. Samantha Brown, a poised, intelligent black woman, stands at the check-in counter, ready for a routine flight. Little does she know, her every move is being watched by an overzealous airport cop with a colossal chip on his shoulder. Beneath the fluorescent lights, suspicions turn to confrontation. Racial undertones seethe in his pointed questions and glaring stares. Unbeknownst to him, Samantha's no ordinary passenger. She's a high-ranking FBI agent. What begins as a case of pure prejudice soon escalates into a cataclysmic turning point, triggering staggering consequences. Samantha Brown woke at dawn to a crisp, cloudless sky bathing her home in warm orange light. She padded into her kitchen, still in slippers, and switched on the coffee maker. The quiet hum of the machine soothed her nerves, because a part of her always danced on edge before traveling. As an FBI assistant director, she was no stranger to cross-country flights, frequent last-minute missions, and the indefinite swirl of tension that came with high-stakes investigations. Yet she cultivated a morning ritual of calm, the coffee aroma, the 10-minute journal session, the softly playing jazz music from her phone. Today's flight was for an official FBI conference in Washington, D.C., focusing on emerging threats to national security. Samantha's job demanded meticulous organization. She double-checked her itinerary for the 100th time. Flight number, seat assignment, gate location, and schedule for the next 48 hours. Important meetings with departmental heads awaited her in D.C. Although she hated traveling under tension, the mission itself exhilarated her. Coordinating law enforcement agencies to tackle new challenges wasn't just her duty, it was her calling. She gently closed her suitcase, mindful not to wake her elderly mother who lived upstairs. Samantha had taken in her mother after her father's passing 6 years ago. As a child, Samantha remembered her parents' unwavering determination to raise her with dignity, self-confidence, and humility. She felt their life lessons forging her path each day, providing an inner resolve in a world that often sought to undermine her. The garage door groaned as she backed out in her sleek black sedan. Even in that moment, with her morning coffee still radiating warmth through her travel mug, her mind drifted to darker corners. She was aware more than most that the world could turn on a dime. One moment, life was peaceful, coffee in hand, a short drive ahead. The next, everything could unravel from a single hateful act or chilling slip of information. Yet she took comfort in her readiness. She was trained. She was prepared. As she maneuvered through Atlanta's early traffic, she found an almost cheerful mood. The day was bright, the skyline twinkling ahead, and her radio played a lively tune that made her bob her head in rhythm. A part of her, a younger self perhaps, wanted to relish life's simple pleasures. Warm sunshine, good music, a hopeful day. She didn't know that soon, inside Hartsfield-Jackson, she would encounter a bitter truth. She would see racism's ugly face re-emerge in a place that prided itself on Southern hospitality. She would be reminded that no matter her rank or accomplishments, prejudice could strike anywhere, anytime. And crucially, she never dreamed that this small trip would become a major turning point in not just her life, but for one egotistical airport cop whose career would hang in the balance. But for now, she sipped her coffee, humming along to her favorite station, completely unaware of the storm brewing within those terminal walls. Officer Chad Johnson had carved out a reputation at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Some said he was just an overzealous security official who took his job seriously. Others found him short-tempered, barking orders at travelers, enthralled by the power that came with the shiny badge on his chest. In truth, Chad's unwavering sense of superiority had hardened into a kind of casual cruelty. He started his day in the staff locker room with a heavy sigh, pulling on his belt loaded with handcuffs and other standard-issue gear. The job rarely provided real excitement, mostly lost baggage squabbles and the occasional scuffle. but Chad's face lit up anytime he spotted an opportunity to flex authority. Perhaps deep down, he was reeling from the frustration of never fulfilling his dream of making detective at the local police department. Maybe he despised how people breezed through this terminal with bigger achievements than his. Maybe, just maybe, he resented how the modern world demanded more empathy than he was willing to give. Chad's colleagues whispered about the departmental reprimands that stained his record. A complaint from an elderly couple who said he had yelled at them. An incident with a teenager who insisted Chad had used verbally abusive language. Formal apologies had been issued, but Chad managed to escape serious discipline. Hartsfield-Jackson was short-staffed, especially for armed airport security, and Chad had used that fact as leverage. Time and again, the airport's management decided to keep him on, lacking the resources or nerve to let him go. It didn't help that Chad often manipulated regulations to push blame onto travelers he deemed non-compliant. Although he hid behind a veneer of upholding airport regulations, those who paid attention saw the prejudice lurking beneath. Maybe it was the dismissive, condescending tone he took with foreign travelers who struggled with English, or the side-eye glances he gave to men with darker complexions. The worst part was that he rarely faced immediate consequences. If confronted about his bias, Chad quickly hammered back with, "I'm just doing my job," or, "You want me to let potential threats slip by?" That was the perfect defense in an airport setting, where safety concerns often trumped subtle arguments about courtesy and prejudice. Walking toward his assigned corridor, Chad glanced at an overhead monitor. Several flights were scheduled to depart in the next 2 hours, one of which would be heading to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. A typical route, but for Chad, the city represented a swirling center of politics and power. He disliked how it fueled a certain type of traveler, often well-dressed, exuding an air of self-importance. He scoffed at the idea of federal officials waltzing in and out, looking down at him. As he took his post at the security checkpoint, his eyes already roved with suspicion. He thrived on confrontation. He believed that if he pressed travelers hard enough, any hidden wrongdoing might unravel. He also believed the small flashes of fear in people's eyes was a sign of victory, proof that he had cornered them. Little did he know that on this particular morning, he'd collide with a traveler whose quiet strength outmatched every ounce of hostility he had to offer. The story that would unfold would become legendary in the corridors of Hartsfield-Jackson, echoing a cautionary tale of how prejudice can lead to one's undoing. Samantha navigated the bustling lines at the check-in kiosk, then proceeded to the security area, her rolling suitcase gliding quietly behind her. The checkpoint was crowded, a typical midweek rush as business travelers hurried to catch early flights. A cacophony of overhead announcements, rolling luggage, and shifting lines surrounded her. Samantha greeted the airport staff with a smile when asked for her ID. She prided herself on being courteous to service workers, whether baristas, custodians, or security staff. Her upbringing taught her that kindness cost nothing. She approached the security conveyor belt and began placing her items in the plastic bins. Laptop, shoes, belt, phone. She carefully laid her purse in one bin, making sure not to misplace any identification. Just as she was about to push the bin forward, she felt someone's eyes on her. Glancing up, she caught sight of Officer Chad Johnson, standing a few feet away, arms folded across his chest. The moment their eyes met, Samantha sensed an instant coldness. While the other travelers were being greeted or at least processed briskly, Chad's gaze lingered on her, unsmiling, borderline confrontational. Samantha tried not to make assumptions. She had encountered her fair share of tough security officials, and she knew from experience that sometimes they wore stoic expressions simply due to job stress. For a fleeting moment, she shrugged it off and returned her focus to placing her items on the belt. Yet the sense of being watched persisted. She glanced sideways and saw Chad step closer, his posture radiating suspicion. He finally stepped forward. "Ma'am, is this your bag?" he asked, gesturing to her carry-on suitcase even before it went through X-ray. "Yes, officer," she replied calmly, offering a tight smile. She instinctively kept her demeanor poised. In the FBI, she had learned to navigate tense encounters with self-control. Chad nodded slowly, scanning her from head to toe. "And you have your ID with you?" "Of course," she said, surprised at the question. She had already shown ID at the check-in desk. She pulled her state driver's license from her purse and handed it over. Chad eyed the card, flipping it a few times. "Where are you headed?" "Washington, D.C. for work." "Work?" he echoed, as if the concept itself was suspect. "What kind of work?" Samantha hesitated, not wanting to broadcast her FBI role in a busy public space. "I'm a federal employee," she stated politely, which was technically true and typically enough to satisfy cursory queries. Chad let out a small huff, returned the license, and said, "Step aside after you get through the metal detector, ma'am. I'll need to ask you some additional questions." A ripple of annoyance flickered through Samantha. She'd done nothing to warrant extra interrogation, but she nodded in compliance. She recognized a confrontation wouldn't help matters. Still, the warning signs flashed in her mind. This was no routine courtesy check. The officer had locked onto her like a predator circling prey. She could only hope it was a misunderstanding, but deep down she knew better. Trouble had found her before she even reached her gate. Even as Samantha passed through the metal detector without any alarms, she couldn't shake a certain unease settling in her stomach. Memories, old and new, bubbled to the surface. She was a black woman in America, a successful professional, an FBI agent with a sterling record, but still a black woman who had faced prejudice. In her early 20s, she had been pulled over for fitting a description. At a department store, she once caught a security guard following her and her mother. Racism had never been an abstract concept. It was a recurring intrusion. She also recalled one of her earliest days at Quantico, where an older agent scowled at her success, as though she hadn't earned her place. Over time, Samantha had grown used to defying stereotypes and pushing through each barrier. But no matter how esteemed her position, she remained braced for potential discrimination, especially in security or law enforcement spaces. Chad beckoned her with 2 fingers once she passed the checkpoint. Sighing inwardly, she stepped to the side, mindful to maintain a professional exterior. She glanced around. A few curious passengers slowed, their eyes flicking between her and the officer. Samantha's instincts flared. The longer this took, the higher the chance she'd miss her flight. "All right, ma'am," Chad said, arms folded. "I need to ask you some questions about your travel plans." He gestured to a small cordoned area near the checkpoint, where a solitary metal desk and chair awaited. Samantha raised an eyebrow. This was unusual. Secondary screening typically took place in a more open area, where additional staff could witness the procedure. She followed him to the desk and took a seat. "Is there a reason I'm being subjected to further screening, Officer Johnson?" she asked in an even tone. She'd quickly noted his name from his badge. Chad pursed his lips. "I asked the questions, ma'am. Now, you said you're traveling to Washington, D.C. for work. Mind telling me exactly what your business is in D.C.? Samantha held his gaze, deciding in that moment how much to reveal. With a measured breath, she said, "I have official meetings at the J. Edgar Hoover Building, naming the FBI headquarters." She leaned in slightly, letting that sink in. Usually, a mention of the FBI was enough to reset any misguided official who might be overstepping. But Chad's eyes only narrowed. He seemed more irritated than impressed. She produced her official FBI credential case from her purse. "I'd like you to take a look at this." Chad took the case with an air of reluctance, flipping it open. His brow furrowed. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but it quickly hardened into suspicion. "Anyone can forge an ID," he said flatly. "This doesn't look standard." Samantha inhaled slowly. "That is a standard FBI credential. If you'd like to verify, you can make a call to the Bureau. They'll confirm my name and position." Chad set the credentials down as if they were worthless. "We have our own procedures here, Miss Brown. You can wait until I run a background check. Until then, stay put." Without waiting for a response, Chad turned and walked away, presumably to consult another officer or look up records on a computer. Samantha's jaw tightened. This wasn't a simple security measure. This felt like a deliberate power play. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Her flight would start boarding in 30 minutes. She reminded herself to keep calm. Anger wouldn't serve her here, yet inside old wounds reopened. She thought of her mother's gentle admonitions. Always stay composed, honey, or they'll twist it against you. She resolved to do just that, but part of her bristled with righteous defiance. She had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't about to roll over in the face of blatant disrespect. The minutes stretched painfully. Samantha sat alone at the metal desk, the roar of travelers passing on the other side of the security checkpoint. Occasionally, someone would pause, cast a curious glance her way, then hurry off. She tried to keep her breathing even, her mind clear. Above all, she was concerned about missing her flight. The clock seemed to taunt her. Eventually, Chad returned with a second officer, a lanky man with a weary expression. This new officer introduced himself as Sergeant David Rollins. He stepped forward politely. "Miss Brown, I understand you're traveling to Washington, D.C., and you've presented an FBI credential." Samantha nodded, noticing that while Rollins looked polite, he also seemed a bit nervous. Perhaps he was junior to Chad or simply trying to maintain the peace. She kept her voice calm and assured, "Yes, that's correct. I'm an assistant director in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm happy to provide further verification if you need." Chad crossed his arms, tapping his foot impatiently. Rollins glanced at Chad, then leaned forward to speak confidentially. "We ran your name in the system. We see you work for the Bureau, but the credentials themselves look, well, Officer Johnson says they're questionable." He looked uncertain. "These are unusual procedures for us, Miss Brown, but if you could be patient." Samantha stood, fed up with the hints of intimidation swirling around her. "Sergeant Rollins, I appreciate caution, but you have run my name. If I'm flagged correctly, you'll see I have no criminal history. My position is well documented. I'm late for a federal conference." She made a point of meeting Chad's gaze. "If you suspect a forgery or wrongdoing, let's do a direct call to the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility. I can even dial them for you. If not, I'd like to proceed to my gate." A small crowd of onlookers waiting to pass security began to gather at a distance. Some whispered behind their hands, no doubt sensing the tension. Chad's eyes flickered with barely disguised hostility, as if Samantha's calm approach only fueled his indignation. Sergeant Rollins fidgeted, uncertain. Chad, however, stayed stoic. "We can't just let people claiming to be FBI waltz through, can we?" he said. "There's protocol. People can buy badges online for all we know." Samantha felt heat rising behind her eyes, but she forced it down. This was shaping up to be an ugly confrontation. She knew that if she lost her temper, it would only give Chad ammunition. She also suspected his questionable ID argument was a front for something else, an underlying bias that made him question her legitimacy from the start. In a measured tone, she said, "Then let's follow protocol, Officer Johnson. Let's do it properly and swiftly. Call the Bureau, verify my information. You'll find that I'm cleared to continue my travel immediately. You have my cooperation, but I must insist we expedite this." Chad eyed her for a moment, then jerked his head at Rollins. "Fine, let's do it," he said dismissively. "We'll see if she's who she says she is." And with that, Samantha braced herself, trying to remain composed, though her mind churned with indignation. If this was some ploy to prove his personal power, she was determined not to let him succeed. Something told her that the confrontation was only beginning, and that it might escalate far beyond what anyone in this terminal anticipated. While Chad marched off to a secure office to make his calls, Sergeant Rollins quietly gestured for Samantha to remain calm. The onlookers slowly dispersed, returning to their lines or heading to their gates. Samantha sighed, rubbing her temples. The flight time was drawing near, and the stress gnawed at her. She thought about simply calling her supervisor at the FBI, or even a friend at the TSA, but she worried about how that might look, like she was pulling strings. She wanted to let standard procedure work for her, to show that she had nothing to hide. Sergeant Rollins offered a small smile. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said quietly, keeping his voice low. "Officer Johnson is thorough." Samantha heard the hesitation in his words. Thorough was not exactly the term she would use, but she gave a polite nod. "Sergeant, is there an estimate on how long this will take? My flight board soon." Rollins shifted on his feet. "I can't say for sure. It depends on how quickly we get hold of the right contacts. I'll do what I can to speed things along." He paused. "We appreciate your cooperation." Samantha realized he was likely in a tough spot. She decided not to direct her frustration at Rollins, who seemed genuinely uncomfortable. "Thank you," she replied. Moments later, a petite woman in her late 20s dressed in a crisp business suit approached them. "Excuse me," she began, glancing between Samantha and Rollins. "Is everything okay here?" Sergeant Rollins tensed, possibly expecting more conflict. Samantha turned to the woman and offered a faint smile. "I'm just being held for verification," Samantha said. "I'm supposed to catch a flight, but there's a procedure they need to follow." The woman frowned. "I saw what happened," she said. "I was behind you in line. I'm also heading to DC. Listen, we're probably on the same flight. Do you need me to speak to the airline on your behalf? Maybe I can explain that you're delayed by security." Samantha felt a rush of gratitude. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it meant the world to her. "That would be very kind of you," she said, handing the stranger her name and flight details. "I'd appreciate if you let them know I might be running late." The woman nodded. "No problem. My name's Carla, by the way. Carla Levin. I'm traveling for a healthcare conference." She glanced at Sergeant Rollins. "I hope everything will be resolved soon." With that, she hurried off, weaving her way through the security crowd. As Samantha returned to her seat at the lonely metal desk, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of relief. At least someone had noticed and cared enough to help, however minor that assistance might be. Nonetheless, the clock was ticking, and each second felt like an hour. She watched Rollins making a call on his walkie-talkie, presumably to check on Chad's progress. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Samantha wondered if Chad was truly verifying her credentials, or if he was taking his time, deliberately letting her sweat. She suspected it might be a bit of both. Even though she had all the right documents, she could still be humiliated or delayed enough to miss her flight. In that moment, she reminded herself that she wasn't just fighting for her own rights. She was standing up against something that too many people silently endured: unwarranted suspicion, especially when traveling, and especially for people of color. If she allowed intimidation to pass without challenge, she'd be betraying not just herself, but everyone who'd ever faced such indignity. So she squared her shoulders, determined to see this through to its rightful conclusion. Inside a small, windowless back office, Chad Johnson stared at the phone on his desk, waiting for a special line to connect. At last, a voice answered. "Federal Bureau of Investigation operator speaking. How can I direct your call?" Chad leaned forward, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes, this is Officer Chad Johnson at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. We've got a passenger here, a Miss Samantha Brown claiming to be an FBI assistant director. I need to verify her credentials." The operator asked for Samantha's identification number and other details. Chad spat them out, tapping his fingers on the desk. The operator put him on hold. In that sterile silence, Chad drummed up every justification for why he should be suspicious. Maybe it was the designer purse she carried, the confident stride, or the calm acceptance of being interrogated. It angered him that she wasn't flustered. She had no trembling lip, no frantic stammer. The more composed she was, the more he wanted to poke holes in her story. In truth, a current of bias coursed through his veins. He disliked her sense of self-assured authority, especially as a black woman stepping confidently into a realm he considered his domain. He wanted to prove she wasn't as important as she thought. Finally, the operator came back. "We confirm that Miss Samantha Brown is indeed an active assistant director of the FBI, with no security flags. I'd appreciate any courtesy you can offer so she can continue her official duties." Chad swallowed hard, an uneasy heat stirring in his gut. He didn't respond immediately, letting the words sink in. Then he mumbled a curt, "Thank you," and hung up. The room felt stifling. The fact that Samantha's story checked out gnawed at him. He had hoped for a different outcome, something that would validate his instincts. Instead, he'd uncovered that she was exactly who she said she was. He stood up and slammed a file drawer shut. His mind whirled with frustration. Part of him wanted to let her go and swallow the embarrassment. Another part, a darker pride, urged him to continue pressing. Maybe find something else, some small technicality. He was used to winning these confrontations. With that cold logic, Chad set his jaw. He decided he would still put her through a final ringer of questions. He reasoned that nobody should be above routine scrutiny, not even the FBI. Returning to the security area, he found Samantha waiting exactly where he'd left her, calm but visibly impatient. Passengers streamed around them, oblivious to the tension. Sergeant Rollins shot Chad a questioning look, but Chad barely glanced at him. "Well," Chad said, nodding, "we verified your status with the FBI. However, we still have some final protocols. I'll need you to answer a few additional questions about the nature of your travel." He sounded mechanical, refusing to concede. Samantha's eyes widened, more with disbelief than anger. "Officer Johnson, I've given all relevant details. I've shown you my ID. You've confirmed with the Bureau. My flight is boarding." "It's standard procedure," Chad insisted, ignoring Sergeant Rollins' twinge of confusion. "If you're in that big of a hurry, you should have planned more time for security." The tension in Samantha's shoulders spiked, but she maintained her composure. Inside, however, her patience was wearing thin. She could sense that this had gone far beyond normal protocol and entered a realm of personal vendetta. She glanced at Sergeant Rollins, hoping he might intervene, but he stared at the floor, clearly torn. Then a voice came from behind them. "Is there a problem?" Carla Levin, the helpful fellow traveler, had returned. She had a gate agent with her, a middle-aged man wearing a name tag that read Delta Airlines Greg Mills. The agent scanned the situation quickly. "This passenger is at risk of missing her flight. Is there a security holdup here?" Samantha exhaled in relief as Carla and the agent approached. The shift in dynamic was palpable. Now Chad had to either publicly articulate a valid reason to detain Samantha further or release her. With a glare, Chad replied, "We're just wrapping up, sir. We have protocol to follow." Greg Mills gestured to Samantha's boarding pass. "We have a full flight about to close the boarding door in minutes. If everything checks out, we'd like to get her on board." Seconds ticked by in a charged silence. Samantha half expected Chad to escalate the confrontation further. Yet something in the presence of the airline agent, and the knowledge that her credentials were thoroughly verified, forced him to relent. He let out a grunt and waved his hand. "Fine," he said coldly. "You're clear to go, Miss Brown." His lips compressed into a tight line. He made no apology, no acknowledgement of the needless trouble. Samantha stared at him, weighing whether to say more. But her flight was on the verge of leaving, and time was precious. She retrieved her things with a controlled nod. "I'll remember this, Officer Johnson," she said quietly, her voice laced with a pointed promise. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, her heart pounding. In that moment, Chad felt a faint pang of foreboding. He didn't realize just how significant that warning was, not yet. His day was about to unravel in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. He had messed with the wrong woman. Samantha hurried through the terminal, gratefully accepting her boarding pass from Greg Mills, and thanking Carla once again for her help. By the time she made it onto the plane, they were already announcing final call for passengers. She slid into her seat, dropping her carry-on in the overhead bin. Her breath came a bit faster than usual. Adrenaline lingered from the confrontation. As the plane taxied out, Samantha closed her eyes momentarily. Stress coiled in her muscles, making it difficult to relax. She mulled over the incident, replaying Chad's sneer, his dismissive tone, his refusal to accept her valid credentials. She had been singled out for reasons that had nothing to do with legitimate security concerns. The confirmation from the FBI should have ended the scrutiny immediately. Instead, he made it personal. A few rows ahead, Carla turned around and gave her a friendly wave. Samantha smiled in return. It was a rare comfort to have found an ally in the chaos. Outside the window, Atlanta's skyline shrank as the plane ascended. Samantha leaned back, forcing herself to think of the upcoming conference. She had important tasks in D.C., team briefings, strategic sessions with other department heads, and an initiative to streamline cross-department data sharing. Typically, such responsibilities energized her, but now, a heavy residue weighed on her mind. The blatant racism and abuse of power by Officer Johnson triggered old wounds she'd worked hard to heal. Samantha's phone buzzed just as they reached cruising altitude. Switching it from airplane mode to Wi-Fi, she saw a message from her FBI colleague, Special Agent Monica Hall. It read, "Just got a weird call from someone in airport security verifying your ID. Everything okay?" Samantha rolled her eyes at the memory of Chad's phone call. She typed back a quick summary of what happened. Within moments, Monica replied, "That's outrageous. You should file a formal complaint. Let me know if you need me as a witness or anything." Samantha felt a flicker of reassurance. She would likely take the matter up the chain, but only after her immediate responsibilities in D.C. concluded. She spent the remainder of the flight drafting an email to the airport's Internal Affairs Department. She detailed the events, the repeated harassment, the undue delay, the blatant disregard for official verification, and the underlying sense of racial bias that permeated the encounter. She didn't want to send it just yet. She would refine it in the hours or days to come, making sure every detail was accurate. But simply drafting it felt empowering, a means of reclaiming dignity stolen in that humiliating scene. By the time the plane touched down at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, Samantha was mentally prepping for her presentation the following day. Her phone had lit up again, colleagues double-checking her itinerary, finalizing schedules. She had a busy few days ahead, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was far from over. People like Chad Johnson often hid behind bureaucratic shields, rarely held accountable. But Samantha wasn't just another passenger. She had resources, influence, and a moral imperative to ensure justice prevailed. She promised herself that once her official duties were handled, she would channel her frustration into action. Because racism, especially wearing a badge, should not go unchecked. And if Chad thought the matter ended the moment she left the airport, he was in for a rude awakening. Inside an elegantly appointed conference room at FBI headquarters, Samantha found herself surrounded by fellow high-ranking officials. Strategists from various federal departments lined the gleaming mahogany table, laptops open, data slides flickering on a projector screen. The meeting soared through intelligence briefings and threat assessments. Samantha expertly navigated questions, offering insights gathered from her specialized team. Yet even as she delivered her report, part of her mind couldn't help returning to the incident at the airport. When the meeting finally concluded, her direct superior, Deputy Director James Walton, motioned for Samantha to join him in his office. She followed him down a pristine hallway adorned with historical FBI memorabilia, photographs of major cases solved, memorial plaques for fallen agents. Deputy Director Walton's office was a reflection of his meticulous nature. Well-organized files, carefully arranged books, and the subtle hum of a coffee machine in the corner. Closing the door behind them, Walton offered her a seat. "I heard about your run-in at Hartsfield-Jackson," he said, his voice measured. Agent Hall gave me a quick rundown. He paused. "You handling it okay?" Samantha sighed, sitting on the edge of the chair. "I'm mostly fine. It's not my first experience with a power-tripping officer, but it's the worst in a while. I'm drafting a formal complaint. This can't be allowed to slide." Walton nodded. "I agree. We can't let that kind of misconduct go unchecked. Do you have everything you need? Witness statements? Any supportive evidence?" She thought about Carla, the airline agent Greg Mills, and Sergeant Rollins. Each had witnessed parts of the altercation. I think so. I'll gather more details. I don't want to escalate it prematurely, but I do want to see accountability. This officer abused his authority. He specifically targeted me in a way that suggests racial bias. Walton leaned back in his chair. We have internal channels to address these matters. Plus, we have professional liaisons with TSA and other airport security divisions. I can help facilitate if you decide to file. But it has to come from you. Samantha appreciated the support. The FBI was not perfect, but in her role she had enough standing to ensure that her complaint would receive serious attention. I want to pursue it, she said firmly. For myself and for anyone else he might have harassed who didn't have the rank or resources to fight back. A faint smile touched Walton's lips. That's the right attitude, Assistant Director Brown. Keep me in the loop, and we'll handle it properly. As she left Walton's office, a renewed sense of resolve filled her. She knew from years of experience that no single complaint would erase systemic biases overnight. But she also knew change often started with the willingness to speak up. She'd be lying if she said she didn't want a measure of personal vindication, too. She was tired of ignorant people presuming she was a fraud or a threat just because of the color of her skin. Perhaps, in a twist of poetic justice, Chad Johnson would come to realize that the woman he tried to humiliate was in a position to shine a glaring light on his misconduct. Walking through the FBI corridors, Samantha felt an unshakable conviction. She had a higher calling, not just to defend her country from threats, but to uphold justice at every level. She intended to use every tool at her disposal to ensure that no one else would suffer Chad Johnson's brand of prejudice again. 3 days later, back in Atlanta, the upper management at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport received a detailed complaint from the FBI regarding Officer Chad Johnson. The letter, signed by Deputy Director Walton and co-signed by Samantha Brown, outlined the incident in stark detail. Unprofessional demeanor, unjustified detention, and the suspicion that racial bias had motivated the escalation of the confrontation. Laura Stevenson, the head of the airport's Internal Affairs Division, sat at her desk with the complaint in hand. She read every line meticulously. She'd seen Chad's name before in the context of citizen complaints. Disgruntled travelers had penned accusations of verbal abuse or excessive scrutiny. Most were dismissed due to insufficient evidence, or they got lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. But this was different. The complaint originated from a high-ranking FBI official. That alone gave it significant weight. Stevenson rubbed her temples, recalling how difficult Chad could be. He was skilled at skirting the line just enough to avoid outright infractions. Yet she had an uneasy feeling that if they dug deeper, they'd find a pattern of misconduct. And now, with the FBI shining a spotlight, ignoring or dismissing it could lead to scandal. The airport's reputation was at stake. She called a meeting with her deputy, Joseph Kim. We have to open an investigation, she told him. A real one, not just a cursory review. Johnson is named specifically, and the allegations are serious. Joseph nodded, scanning the complaint. The FBI usually doesn't file this level of complaint for a minor infraction. This suggests a pretty big push from them. Stevenson sighed. Yes, and we can't afford to sweep it under the rug. Talk to Chad's supervisors. Let's see if we can get an official statement from him, any security footage, witness reports. Joseph jotted notes, then left to coordinate the steps. Within hours, a formal notice of investigation was delivered to Officer Chad Johnson's mailbox. He read it in the break room, his face growing stony with disbelief. The language was direct. He stood accused of racial discrimination, official misconduct, and harassment of a verified FBI assistant director. Chad's jaw clenched. Anger churned in his gut. He couldn't believe that woman had so much pull. He stormed out, heading to his supervisor's office, half expecting them to laugh off the complaint. But his supervisor didn't laugh. They explained that an external review would be launched and that Chad was expected to cooperate. Stay calm, the supervisor warned. We don't need a scene. Chad, however, found it impossible to remain calm. He muttered curses under his breath and slammed the office door on his way out. Anger and panic warred within him. He had encountered complaints before, but never from someone with the authority to demand a deep investigation. He seethed at the thought that Samantha Brown, a woman he still considered beneath him, had the power to threaten his job. Yet he also felt a tinge of fear. What if they uncovered more from his past? What if he was forced to face real consequences this time? The investigation was underway, and for the first time in his career, Chad realized he was in real jeopardy. Over the next few weeks, a thorough investigation consumed Hartsfield-Jackson's Internal Affairs Department. Staffers combed through security logs, pulling camera footage from the day of Samantha Brown's confrontation with Chad. They interviewed Sergeant Rollins, Carla Levin, and the airline agent Greg Mills. Each witness recounted Samantha's composure and Chad's aggressive demeanor, describing how he ignored standard procedures even after verifying her status as an FBI official. As these pieces fell into place, a disturbing pattern emerged. Records revealed that Chad had disproportionately flagged minority travelers for secondary inspections. There were written complaints from individuals describing interactions eerily similar to Samantha's. Even one of Chad's colleagues quietly admitted that Chad had a bit of a problem with travelers of color, although fear of retaliation had prevented him from filing a formal statement. Laura Stevenson compiled all this data into a comprehensive report for the final review committee. The more she uncovered, the more her stomach knotted. It wasn't simply one impulsive act of prejudice. It was a persistent abuse of power that had endured for years. That Chad remained employed this long was a testament to the airport's understaffing and managerial reluctance to rock the boat. On the designated day for Chad's disciplinary hearing, he arrived wearing his uniform, face set in a grim line. The hearing took place in a private conference room, with a panel of officials from Internal Affairs, Airport Management, and legal advisors. Chad sat at a table, flanked by his union representative, eyes shifting nervously. The proceedings began with a formal reading of the allegations. Misconduct, harassment, racial discrimination, and insubordination. Samantha Brown wasn't present in person, but her written statement was read aloud. She laid out every detail, from the initial suspicious stares to his refusal to release her even after the FBI credentials were verified. She concluded with, "I firmly believe that Officer Johnson's actions were fueled by racial bias, as there was no justification for his continued harassment." Chad's face hardened. Through his representative, he tried to argue that he was merely following protocol, that Samantha's ID appeared unusual, and that verifying such a claim required extra scrutiny. He denied any racial motivation. However, Internal Affairs countered with witness testimony and camera footage, illustrating how Chad treated other travelers differently that morning, letting them pass with minimal checks, while singling out Samantha for extended interrogation. Finally, Stevenson presented the data about Chad's disproportionate flagging of minorities over the years. She listed date after date, complaint after complaint. The collective weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Chad's union representative looked increasingly deflated, offering only generic rebuttals about the need for heightened vigilance. After hours of deliberation, the panel announced its decision. Chad Johnson was to be immediately terminated for egregious misconduct. The panel also recommended that the district attorney review the findings for possible civil rights violations. The once arrogant officer slumped in his chair, his face pale. He tried to protest, but security escorted him out. His badge was revoked, and he was told not to return to the airport. The day ended with a solemn press release from Hartsfield-Jackson, confirming the termination of an officer due to misconduct. Inside the airport corridors, staff exchanged hushed whispers. Some were relieved, feeling that justice had been served. Others were anxious about the ensuing fallout. But one sentiment was clear. Chad Johnson's downfall was swift and severe, and it sent a strong message that prejudice in a uniform could no longer be brushed aside. In the weeks following Chad's termination, word spread like wildfire throughout local law enforcement circles. Some officers who had been close to Chad severed ties, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. Others expressed shock. Chad had long been known for his abrasive style. But few expected such a dramatic, publicized downfall. The local media, hungry for a story, latched onto headlines like, "Airport cop fired after racial profiling FBI official." The phrase alone carried powerful imagery, fueling debate on news channels and social media. Chad found himself virtually unemployable. Every background check revealed he had been dismissed for misconduct, specifically for discriminatory practices. Doors closed, interviews evaporated. Even friends who once admired him for his toughness distanced themselves. He retreated into his modest apartment, blinds drawn, as though hiding from the world. Samantha's days resumed their usual intensity at the Bureau. She spearheaded new collaborative efforts between different intelligence branches, tackling everything from cyber threats to organized crime. Yet every so often she received an email or phone call from someone who had heard the story. People she'd never met thanked her, often in emotional terms. One was a single mother from Chicago who was wrongfully singled out at an airport security line once. Another was a college student from Georgia who described her fear when singled out by an officer who smelled trouble because she wore a hoodie. These stories reminded Samantha that her complaint had tapped into a widespread issue, the silent endurance of discrimination many travelers faced but rarely had the resources to challenge. In the midst of this, a quiet transformation took place at Hartsfield-Jackson. Internal Affairs, spurred by the FBI's scrutiny, instituted new guidelines for how security officers were trained in bias recognition and de-escalation techniques. Officers underwent refresher courses, including role-play scenarios to understand how their tone, stance, and language could intimidate travelers. Supervisors were instructed to keep a closer watch on disproportionate targeting, with logs requiring justification for every secondary inspection. Laura Stevenson led the initiative with renewed vigor. She recognized that the airport owed travelers a safe, respectful environment. She also recognized that Chad's case was symptomatic of a deeper malaise, one that demanded systemic change. Data was key. They began collecting statistical records on stops and searches, looking for patterns. And in a stroke of transparency, these reports were shared with a civilian oversight committee. If the ratio of any demographic group's stops skewed heavily without legitimate cause, it would trigger an internal review. Sergeant Rollins found himself unexpectedly at the center of this shift. His willingness to answer questions truthfully during the investigation had painted him as someone willing to challenge the status quo. Consequently, Stevenson called him into her office. "We're looking for liaisons who can bridge the gap between frontline security officers and management," she told him. "We need people who won't let questionable behavior slide under the radar." Rollins, originally a man of few words, discovered a sense of purpose in ensuring the airport's environment improved. He accepted the liaison role, attending diversity and bias trainings alongside new hires. He felt relief knowing that Chad's brand of bullying wouldn't be tolerated anymore. Rollins found it ironic that he had once envied Chad's boldness. Now he was grateful that some lines had been drawn clearly. Boldness without accountability was merely abuse. Meanwhile, Carla Levin, the helpful passenger, found her act of kindness blossomed into an ongoing friendship with Samantha. It started with a simple email. "Hope you got to DC okay and that everything worked out with that officer." They exchanged stories of their respective conferences, discovering common ground in their passion for justice. Carla in healthcare access, Samantha in law enforcement. A few weeks later, Carla invited Samantha to speak at a small women's leadership forum. Samantha graciously accepted, sharing her experience of rising through the ranks of the FBI and her thoughts on confronting prejudice head-on. The audience, mostly young professionals, listened raptly as she recounted the day at Hartsfield-Jackson. One of the attendees asked, "Don't you worry about blowback when speaking up?" Samantha answered with conviction, "Silence has its own blowback. If we don't speak, we allow injustice to breathe." We need to break the cycle. The story even reached a classroom of aspiring law students at Emory University in Atlanta. Their professor, citing the case as a real-life example, assigned an essay question: analyze the ethical and legal ramifications of Officer Chad Johnson's conduct and discuss how institutional policies can prevent such incidents. Samantha was invited to attend a panel discussion with the students. She welcomed the opportunity, hoping the next generation of legal minds would cultivate a deep respect for equality before the law. The panel session was lively. Students asked, could the FBI have pressed charges? And, was Chad's termination too harsh or not harsh enough? Samantha explained that a departmental firing was only one facet. Civil or criminal charges for discrimination required a separate legal standard to prove violation of civil rights. While the district attorney's review was ongoing, the main takeaway, Samantha stressed, was that robust policy and oversight had to be in place to prevent bias from turning into institutional harm. Behind the scenes, Chad wrestled with the consequences of his downfall. A letter arrived from the district attorney's office, indicating they were investigating a possible pattern of civil rights abuses. Chad's attorney advised him to consider a plea deal if charges were filed. Shaken and resentful, Chad tried to piece together a defense. He insisted that he wasn't racist, that everyone else was overreacting. He never apologized, never saw the bigger picture of how his actions harmed innocent travelers. His once proud posture sagged under the stress. Former friends who still spoke to him encouraged him to own his mistakes and apologize, but pride held him back. Eventually, the civil rights investigation concluded that while Chad's conduct was systematically biased, proving criminal intent in court could be challenging. The district attorney, however, did file a civil lawsuit against Chad and the airport. While the airport, protected by official immunities, settled out of court, Chad found himself personally liable for some portion of damages. It was a blow that hammered him financially, sealing the karmic cycle. He lost his house, forced to move into a modest apartment in a less expensive area. He grew bitter, blaming Samantha Brown for what he dubbed his ruined life. Those words stayed with Samantha. She recognized the truth. The problem was bigger than Chad or any single airport. The same biases could take root in any institution where power met prejudice. But shining a light on injustice forced accountability. The faintest beam could guide those in darkness toward change. In the months that followed, Samantha's email inbox was full of invitations to speak on panels about racial profiling and law enforcement reform. She accepted some, politely declined others, mindful to preserve her time and well-being. Each speech she delivered carried a renewed sense of purpose. She wove in her personal story, how an ordinary trip at the airport could become a flashpoint for broader discussions on dignity, law, and race in America. Gradually, the press attention died down, replaced by fresher headlines. People at the airport rarely spoke of Chad Johnson by name anymore. Instead, they repeated the lessons gleaned from the fiasco. Do your job, but do it right. Treat travelers as people, not targets. The policy changes at Hartsfield-Jackson became a model for other airports facing similar concerns, showcasing how a high-profile complaint could prompt tangible reforms. For Samantha, life moved on in the best way possible. She continued climbing within the Bureau, always championing diversity and justice within its ranks. She trained new agents, emphasizing empathy as a crucial investigative tool. She found that the more she shared her experiences, both the triumphs and the tribulations, the stronger the next generation of law enforcement became. And in quiet moments, she cherished the knowledge that her seemingly small decision to stand up for herself at the airport had rippled out to protect many others. In time, people might forget the details of that day at the check-in counter, the heated stares, the refusal to let her pass, the phone call verifying her FBI status. But they would remember the principle that no one, no matter how powerful their badge or uniform, is beyond accountability. And that is how real change begins. We hope Samantha's story reminds us all that integrity and courage can make a world of difference, even in the face of blatant discrimination. No one is above the law, and no one should be made to feel powerless when an authority figure abuses their position. Let Samantha's tenacity inspire you to stand firm for your rights, and let this powerful outcome encourage institutions everywhere to root out prejudice. If you found value and insight in this dramatic tale, if it sparked conversation or raised awareness, please show your support. Like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Together we can shine a light on injustice, champion fairness, and celebrate the moments when courage triumphs. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay vigilant, stay kind, and always stand up for what's right.